Welcome to this year's Elephant in the Room. That was actually my heartbeat because this is one of the first times we've been in person at an event. So hopefully it'll calm down as we get into it. But welcome to this year's edition of Elephant in the Room. Part of the event and what we try to hold here is no slides. And Kevin and Frans are very comfortable not talking to slides, but the idea is that we have an engaging conversation. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you here today. So my name is Michael Summerton, I'm your host today, and we're gathered here not just to discuss, but to dissect, to question, to seek to understand this intricate tapestry which we call our economic and political landscape. And the elephant in the room is not our perhaps expanded waistlines post-lockdown, but rather the complex issues that face us and shape our nation and our world today. So thank you for joining us today. And we're privileged to have with me on stage two esteemed panelists. Dr. Frans Prunier, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today. Social Research Foundation Chairman and political commentator. And Kevin Lings, Chief Economist at Standard. Thank you for joining us today. Both renowned for their insightful perspectives and ability to cut through the noise and get right to the heart of the issues. So today they will hopefully share their views on a range of topics, from geopolitical changes to economic indicators and some of the dynamics at play in our own country. And last but not least, our audience, financial advisors. You guys are crucial to shaping our future in your conversations with clients, your guidance of their decision making. And so hopefully today we'll provide you with some valuable insights to hold those perspectives for your clients going forward. So let's dive in to the heart of the matter and address the elephant in the room. Welcome, and I hope you enjoy the discussion. And first, while Kevin he's an old hand at elephants in the room, so I'm going to do a baptism by fire and ask Frans to kick us off with some opening remarks.
Right. Michael, thank you. Good morning to everyone. I want to stress three things for you through the course of this chat, so give you a heads up on what they are. First is I don't think anything's gone wrong with the country's politics. What's going on is simply this, that for 400 years, in the territory that's today South Africa, one powerful actor, the Dutch, the British, the Afrikaners, the apartheid government, the liberation movements, the ANC, could essentially decide on what policy was, and the rest of society had to go along with it. But that politics does not reflect the society itself. And the ANC's dominance after 94, with 60% of the vote, was simply a legacy effect of the first 400 years. Had at any point in that 400 years people been able to choose their government, we would not have had a structure where a big party has 60 or 70% of the vote, the second has 20, and there are a few others. And the ANC's own dominance was always going to fade at the moment that lived experience of apartheid faded away in favour of present economic and political challenges. And we're busy going through that transition at the moment, and it's perfectly good and normal, and we're actually fortunate relative to other emerging markets that when we get into trouble, we've got means short of coercion and violence of changing the society. And a decade or so out from here, what our political system is going to look like is like a hybrid of the current Knesset, the Israeli parliament, and the Bundestag. Biggest parties are going to have 30-something% of the vote. There'll be a second one with about 20, and there'll be a lot of small ones. And the people who govern the future South Africa and its regions won't be the biggest political players, but will be the best deal makers. That's going to be theme number one for me. Theme number two, the economy and Eskom. I'm going to tell you that we do not have an electricity generation or transmission problem. We should not have had a load shedding problem to begin with. I've been saying from the beginning of the year to often very disbelieving clients in the face of warnings of black starts at stage 8 to the end of the world, that I thought load shedding would lessen greatly through the year, would dissipate, and I will suggest to you later that South Africa can generate enough electricity to again aspire to emerging market growth averages over the next decade without building a new power station or a new transmission line. And I've had a lot of hostility to that view. But it's convenient, actually. It's happened a lot faster. I mean, for the last 3 weeks, we've been averaging stage 1.5, not stage 8. And the third thing I'll go into is South Africa's foreign policy and positioning, which is a lot of noise around in the media. I don't think it's catastrophic. I'll tell you that the West and the ANC and the government desire dramatic de-escalation. South African government's position is in support of Russia. There's no point in pretending it's not. But it also desires, sincerely so, in my experience, and I've been around long enough not to be naive on these things, it desires to maintain its trade and economic relationships with the US and with Europe, and we can go into the efforts. So I don't buy the idea that sanctions are absurd at the moment, and even on AGOA, our American trade partners don't have as much wiggle room as some in the media are suggesting.
Some interesting opening salvos, thank you, France. And while the audience is sort of digesting some of those opening thoughts, Kevin, maybe just sort of opening remarks from you.
Sure, well, look, I'm pleased we don't have an electricity problem. We just Okay, so I like France's idea of 3 things, so let's go with 3 things. So we end up with 6 things in total. The first, I would say, is what's called fragmented globalization. So the world's become globalized, which is very good for world growth, productivity, all kinds of things. But in recent years, that globalized world has become fragmented. And it's fragmented around, obviously, politics, which is unhelpful in terms of the economic outcome. And the fragmentation is really between China and the US, where China is clearly creating its own enclave of supporters and has turned inward, which is not good for the world. So China's become more worried about its own internal dynamics, less focused on exporting to success, less focused on importing from everybody, and more about make sure that we look after ourselves. And you see that in various guises, including in the tech sector, and it's unhelpful. It's incredibly unhelpful for the world. And obviously that sets up a conflict with the US, and anytime you have kind of the superpowers in conflict, that's not good for the world economy. And obviously South Africa and Africa is choosing sides, right? Everybody's choosing sides a little bit here. And you can see that with the BRICS. A lot of people want to join the BRICS. That's choosing sides. And understandably, South Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa are choosing China over the US. And if you look at the trade relationship, the trade imbalance, it overwhelmingly favors China. Sub-Saharan Africa overwhelmingly trades with China. The US has become less and less important. I was looking at exports, right? So take Sub-Saharan Africa exports. And you go back 15 years, the exports to the US and the exports to China were more or less the same amount in dollars, 15 years ago. Fast forward 15 years. Over that time, exports, Sub-Saharan Africa exports to the US has declined by an average of 5% a year. Declined. Exports to China has grown by an average of 3.6%. The gap has opened enormous. So the alliance is very clear if you're in this part of the world, that is very much China, and almost by implication, it's Russia. So that's the one area, and I must say it's unhelpful. Hey? It really doesn't help the world economy in terms of growth and prosperity and productivity and inflation. There's no real upside in terms of economics from that political stuff. The second issue is the world kind of woke up late to the inflation problem. Inflation caught everybody off guard, especially the central banks. The guys who are tasked with fighting inflation, they didn't see it, and even when it materialized, they didn't recognize it. And when they did, they then had to scramble. And so most of the major central banks, not all of them, most of the major central banks have been pushing rates up, and they're not at the top of the rate cycle. So we're still in a interest rate hiking phase, if you like. And obviously we've got to work out how much damage does that do. You can't hike interest rates this fast, this far, and think there are no consequences of it. And what worries us, I guess, is the delayed effect. Because we know over history, interest rates do actually take time to have an effect. Because we've accelerated interest rates, we don't know what that effect is. And we can't gauge that, and it's all ahead of us. And South Africa gets caught up in that. Very difficult, near impossible for South Africa to say, no, we're not hiking rates, when the rest of the world, especially the US, is hiking rates. And so, to some extent, we are a victim of that environment, and I would argue pretty much nothing we can do about it. The third issue is when I look at South Africa, we're talking about 0.1% growth this year, 0.1. And when I look at the data, I oscillate between minus 0.1 and plus 0.1, and I get excited when there's that change. And in reality, it doesn't matter. There's no growth going on. That's the end message. And the difficulty with that is that I keep coming back to the basic issue. South Africa's population grows at 1.3% a year. And because of that fact, that is not going to change. You have to have a faster, better performing economy. It's impossible to achieve any form of success, any form of improvement in lifestyle, unless the economy grows faster. I keep saying, there's no substitute for better economic growth. You don't have an alternative. So think about NHI. You're trying to introduce NHI into an economy with a record level of unemployment and no economic growth. There's no chance of that being successful. Zero. You struggle to do that in prosperous economies where people can pay their way. So you've got to focus on the key issue. The key issue is economic growth. So how much would we have to grow by? 600,000 people enter the job market every year. Net. People die, people retire, people leave school, leave university. The net is 600,000. That's the yardstick. And so you would want government to be sitting down saying, how do I get an environment in which 600,000 people can get a job every year? Not 1 year, every single year. Into the future. You do that, you have a vibrant economy. You have a chance of success, right? You don't do that, and you're going to keep on decaying, no matter what. If you can't cope with the population, the decay will continue. What we've been focused on is the speed of decay. The decay accelerated after 2010, right? Change in politics, state capture, mismanagement of government finances. The decay of the South African economy accelerated. Right now, that decay is less pronounced, less intense, but it's still continuing. And if you don't think it is, look at the blue drop and the green drop report that came out 10 days ago that told us the quality of water and sanitation in South Africa. The decay continues. And so for me, the focus is first, arrest the decay, stop the economy decaying. And when that's under control, we can think about how we grow the economy. Big issue, lot to discuss around that.
Sure. Sobering opening remarks. Thank you.
Yeah. But as long as we got electricity, we'll be okay.
And I guess that's the point, is that we don't want to shy away from the harsh truth. And so we're going to hear some more about the local economy in a bit. So if we could just sort of zoom out, because you mentioned US interest rates, Kevin, maybe Frans, I could just turn to you to sort of set the stage. South Africa, it's not an island, we like to have our heads buried in the sand, but actually there's a whole lot of things happening on the global stage at the moment, and with war in the Ukraine, etc. How do you see South Africa's position on the international stage evolving over the next few years? And what are some of those hotspots?
We've got an asset in the country that's very seldom written about. That is where we fit into the world. To our right, sort of, standing Cape Town, is the Indian Ocean and the Indian Ocean River. And China sort of sits on the furthest point of that, and then India in the middle, and then Africa's east coast. Well, China has a strategy called the String of Pearls strategy, which is to expand its influence as a string of pearls eastward into the Pacific, which is now going through the Solomon Islands, and then westwards into Africa's east coast, which is done with the base at Djibouti, that guards the entrance to the Suez Canal. China's working its way through the Suez Canal. It has what are called commercial ports in Haifa and merging Greece and Italy, which an American think tank has called stepping stones to one day dominate the Atlantic, which is frightening for American Western security thinkers. As it meets more resistance in the Mediterranean, China moves down Africa's east coast. So we've had the recent naval exercises with China and Russia down our coast. On our left is the South Atlantic, which is now one of the most valuable pieces of geostrategic real estate in the world. It hosted the opening battles of the First and Second World Wars, and how the naval battles, and how those engagements ended determined access to the North Atlantic and ultimately the conclusion of both battles. Xi in China is likely going to back Argentina's claim to the Falklands, and in exchange have a facility, a string of pearls type facility off the South American coast, which will guard the Drake Strait, which is the sea passage that runs around South America into the bottom of the South Atlantic. China is also likely going to have a naval facility at Bata in Equatorial Guinea. And an American general told Congress 2 years ago that he was obviously frustrated with politicians, and he said to them, this is not a place where they will get gas and groceries. This is somewhere to repair vessels and re-equip with munitions. And sailing from Bata, the Chinese Navy can influence access to the northern access point to the South Atlantic, and are closer to New York than if they had a base in Hawaii. And the final access point to the South Atlantic is the port at Simonstown or the port at Walfish Bay. And there is a very intense diplomatic wrangle going on across the continent for access to those points. If something goes wrong in the Suez and Panama Canals, all global bulk shipping moves between the 50th and 60th parallel south, past Simonstown, Cape Town, past the Drake Strait. Critical minerals are just a second insight into the geostrategic importance of South Africa. Take some sort of trade action against us, and you can go and get your platinum from Russia or Zimbabwe. These are the choices that remain. Other than that you mine from old cars. The French are being pushed out of West Africa by the Russians through Wagner, the Russian security firm. It's going to become very, very difficult for the West to source the critical minerals it needs to do whatever, I don't know quite what to do with them. Make very important chips. They're going to lose that access. Africa is now home to more cities of 1 million people than Europe and America combined. And those cities are home to consumers whose income levels are growing fast enough to make Africa one of the most attractive consumer destinations in the future world during an era of anticipated global slowdown. And it's 50 votes, Africa, on global fora, such as the US. It's the Western world is squeezed on Africa. There's a lot in our media about the goers up for grabs and it was on the line, and there's even some wild talk of sanctions. Any firm action of that nature against South Africa now, on part of the West, pushes it deeper into Russia's orbit. And I might go as far as to suggest to you that our strategic position is one of the most valuable economic assets we now possess, if we learn how to leverage it. And it goes wrong and becomes a bit of a shambles often because of the ineptitude of South Africa's Foreign Affairs Department and our ambassadors around the world, which is a point I can tell you will privately be conceded by senior leaders in the government. But this is, when you think about South Africa and its place in the world, and you read about our foreign policy positioning and the like, and our future will just become an island. Be aware of this context. It's going to become more and more important. And the future South African government that learns how to leverage that, similar to India's approach, absolutely brilliant, learns to leverage that, will win concessions from both the West and the East. and if it does so intelligently in a window that coincides with the emergence here of a new type of South African government, coalition of some sort, which we will get to in time. The combination of those forces, plus my points on energy, you start adding these things together, and you strip hope and fear out of your analysis. There's no place in what you think or what you tell your clients. You just do the hard, cold analysis. And you realize that the strategic position in South Africa now is more finely balanced than much of the sort of mainstream commentary was doing.
Thanks, France. So, Kevin, you mentioned US interest rates, and I guess part of some of the political back and forth that France alluded to is influenced by how well a country is doing, interest rate setting, etc. We've had low for long, and recently we've seen increases in US interest rates. Maybe just talk us through, you said South Africa can't really respond to that. We sort of have to participate. But what should we be watching in terms of indicators on the global stage going forward?
So we're very beholden to the US when it comes to the financial markets. And it's something I think China's got ambitions about, right? So at the moment, if you look at France talking about China's role, it tends to be concentrated in political alliances, its influence in the world, trade, that sort of thing. But its role in financial markets is relatively small. And obviously they want to change that. They I think have ambitions for their currency to be the reserve currency of the world. I think they have that type of idea, but that's going to take time from here. The US, I read about the de-dollarization, and geez, I looked at the latest data. 2022, the dollar is 86% of the current world's currency market. China sits at 10 or 11%. It's very small. It's grown a bit, but it's got a long way to go. So the financial environment and the flow of capital around the world is dictated by the US, absolutely. And what that means for us is that when the US puts up interest rates and creates that pressure on where capital goes, South Africa's kind of forced into responding. Now, I don't think I said at the beginning, we kind of got very limited choice. Obviously, if our inflation rate was minus 2%, would we be putting up interest rates? No. But our inflation rate in South Africa tends to reflect what's going on globally. Our inflation rate very seldom deviates meaningfully from the global trend. And the reason is we're a very open economy. By that I mean more than 50% of South Africa's GDP is either imported or exported. So global pricing has a big impact on South African pricing, and it finds its way into our market. So the US put up rates. They, as I said, they got it wrong. They had to accelerate rates. Inflation went to 9.1% last year, middle of last year in the US, against a target of 2%. So that's kind of, you missed that. They called it front loading, which is a fancy way of saying that we made a mistake and now we have to catch up. So the interest rate hikes would really catch up, accelerated hikes, which they called front loading. And now they've pretty much done most of their hiking. They haven't done all of it because that's what the chairman of the Federal Reserve keeps telling us. There's a bit more to go. So you would argue maybe another 1 or 2 interest rate hikes this year, 25 basis points each, and then hopefully you're done. But that leaves US interest rates pretty much at around 5.75% if you get 2 more hikes from here. And it's going to create additional pressure on South Africa to follow suit because we starved of capital. We need foreign capital. We don't have enough. We have an incredibly low savings rate in this country. And so in order for us to kind of keep functioning, we've got to constantly attract foreign capital. And how do you attract foreign capital? Well, if you don't have good growth, which we don't, it's very difficult to get FDI, more long-term investment, where companies come into South Africa and establish a business and put a huge amount of money on the ground. So we tend to be more reliant on portfolio flows. And in order to bolster that ability to attract those flows, we kind of have to respond in interest rates. And so that's part of the issue. And when you meet with the Reserve Bank, it's clear that they are much more acutely aware of what's going on globally than they necessarily let on. So if you listen to the speech after the interest rate decision, they'll talk about the global environment. But when you meet with them more separately, they delve into the global environment a hell of a lot more. And it's because they meet with all the major central bankers at least once a quarter. So there's a place called the BIS, Bank of International Settlements. Think of that as the central bank to the central banks. And once a quarter they have a meeting, and all the major central bank governors, or whatever you call them, chairmen, go off to, I'm assuming, an exotic hotel somewhere in an exotic location, and they talk about interest rates and inflation. And so Lesetja, the governor of the South African Reserve Bank, meets with Jerome Powell, meets with Christine Lagarde on a very regular basis, and would know them on a personal level. And that discussion, you can imagine if you're meeting with these central bankers, what is that discussion about? It's all about, are we doing enough to fight inflation? And South Africa doesn't want to pitch up at those meetings and being accused of not playing their part. So it creates a lot of pressure in the system, and that pressure gets revealed in South Africa in terms of interest rates. And so we kind of follow suit. And some of it absolutely is justified, right? And the way to think about it, because I get this question a lot, why is the Reserve Bank putting up interest rates when the economy is already weak? You're just weakening an already weak economy. And the answer to that is absolutely yes. You are going to weaken an already weak economy. But think about it in the opposite. Think about what would be the inflation rate in South Africa had you not increased interest rates at all. If Lesetja woke up and said, look, there's not much I can do, a lot of these interest rates are externally driven, it's got to do with Russia, Ukraine, and the wheat price, not much I can do, I'm not going to put up interest rates, I'm just going to hurt the economy, what would happen to inflation? It would tend to feed on itself, and it becomes self-fulfilling because inflation goes up, and then people say, oh, I need higher wages, and they get higher wages because of strong trade unions. The higher wages lead to more inflation, and you get a ratcheting effect. And I've got no doubt we'd be talking about double-digit inflation now in South Africa had we not hiked interest rates. So I think it does help, although it is not the most effective tool possible. I think we're getting close to the top of the rate cycle. As I said, the US, I think, will be at the top within the next couple of months. I think South Africa will be at the top, we hope, at the next meeting. And then we probably keep rates unchanged for a period of time, let them have some time to work, which we're saying is into the first half of next year. You're looking at sustained high rates. And then you start to cut rates into the second half of next year because we assume they've done their job. Inflation comes down more. Already inflation is a lot lower in most parts of the world. And so you go into another economic upswing. And I'm getting more enthused by the next business cycle because I buy into the idea of France saying, load shedding, we're going to get on top of this, right, for various reasons. And if we then project that into next year and the year beyond, load shedding from the Reserve Bank says it costs South Africa 2% GDP growth. The load shedding we've had cost 2% GDP growth. You take away load shedding, by implication, you've got more GDP growth. You cut interest rates at exactly that time, the world economy is cutting rates. You could have the start, with some other factors, the start of a decent economic upswing. So, as much as I'm negative about South Africa this year, I'm more positive about South Africa over the next 2 years as we cut interest rates and as the world cut interest rates. The thing I'm watching, which is kind of a long way of answering your question, don't you think? The thing I'm watching is simply inflation. Inflation has to behave, it has to come down. The central bank in the US, the Federal Reserve, cannot start to cut interest rates when inflation is not under control. They will not and they cannot. They can't give up their credibility in that way. They can't say, oh, well, we got close, guys. Inflation's 3.5, the target's 4. It's okay, we're more or less there. Let's cut interest rates. They can't do that. So the key thing to watch is inflation making progress. As soon as it's in sight of the target, then you can get the interest rate cuts, and that relieves pressure on everybody, and that's a good time for SA.
Kevin, something you mentioned at the beginning of your last answer was the interconnectedness between, so for example, the Reserve Bank and other organizations around the world. And that's true at a Reserve Bank level as it is with politics and politicians. And so we've seen a few very newsworthy sort of diplomacy issues in the last 12 months. There was the Lady R in Simonstown, and then more recently this incident over the weekend in Poland. How would, maybe France, how would you describe our relationship with major global players like Russia, America, India? And if somebody were to say, like, are we fundamentally anti-Western? Like, how would you respond to that?
I'll take you through this conversation with some of the people who make these policies. There is South Africa is a sovereign state, and it's free to make whatever foreign policy it chooses. There is a historical relationship with the former Soviet Union, which is valued, and it will be very difficult for anyone in the West to override that importance. And there are current relationships that one can speculate around, but I don't have those facts. That's number one. The second point is that we have extremely valuable trade benefits that we win, particularly we often run trade surplus with the US. And our single largest export market is Europe as a whole. That's still by a long shot the case. And this is valued by the South African government. This has been lost in the Malay. Part of the reason why it's been lost is incompetence in the Foreign Affairs Department, inability to articulate an actually very nuanced position. That yes, we have ties with Russia particularly. These are valuable ties. There are ideological reasons for that. Like these are things that are very important to people in the South African government. But we don't wish those relationships to compromise the relationship that we have with the Western world. But we find this very difficult to articulate. I think that of late, I think Western diplomats in South Africa for the last 25 years have found it very difficult to understand the country. They often come in search of Mandela's Rainbow Nation, and they spend their term in office seeking that. They don't find it, and they leave very frustrated. And the next Western diplomat comes in and does the same thing. I find diplomats from the let's call it the non-liberal democratic world, understand South Africa completely. They understand there's a revolutionary ideology that sits at a certain level in policy making. But not sufficient to abandon pragmatism entirely, but it is present. Put it this way, Russian and Chinese diplomats have never asked me, why does the government do this? And Western diplomats ask why, it's only all the time. Why did they do that? Why did they do this? That, I think, is starting to change. And I think the blow up after Ambassador Brigati, hosted his press conferences, the American ambassador went after the South Africans, said, you know, you guys are a bunch of deplorables, essentially. How can you have this relationship? South Africa reacted very firmly to that. In the aftermath of that, there has been a sincere effort, as I have observed it, in what I've observed, which isn't obviously a complete picture, of a desire for dramatic de-escalation. There have been formal delegations that have been sent around to each other, and there have been a lot of back-channel delegations as well. So let's just calm down and reset this relationship and understand where we sit with each other. A week or so ago, Senator Coons, he's an American, has very close ties to South Africa. He was chap who fought the chicken wars. I don't know if you remember, before COVID, there were chicken wars. And he was very involved in those. And a week ago, he and 3 congressional colleagues wrote a letter that said South Africa shouldn't host the next AGOA meeting. And in the mainstream narrative, that was taken as another signal that they're coming for us and we're going to be sanctioned and AGOA's lost, etc. I'd suggest to you that you consider another interpretation of that letter. that the administration in Washington is concerned that a head of steam builds up against South Africa in Congress, and that a few perhaps exuberant congressmen and women decide that this is a sort of pony they can ride to their own political advantage to say, cut South Africa off from the world, or bomb it back into the Stone Age, whatever the case is. And that this letter was drafted as an effort to head that off by saying, we have this in hand, we are taking firm action against the South Africans for whatever they're up to with the Russians. But in practice, this is an effort to try and make sure that dangerous opposition to South Africa's relationship with the US doesn't catch on in Washington. Similar efforts, I think, are happening in Europe and the like, and I think the European diplomats now who will need to concede that we probably can't force South Africa's hand on Russia. So everywhere one looks and comes across, I read media that the relationship's in peril, we're going to fall apart, we'll be sanctioned, the guy's going to go. But then in practice, in the real world, the decisions are taken, what I see is completely the opposite of that happening. What's also to our advantage is that the war in Europe is probably going to come to an end. The Ukrainians are busy with their final last push in the southeast. The push is likely to fail. Western defense chiefs are going to tell their politicians, that's it. We've done everything we can. And the two sides are going to dig into their present position, as happened in that part of Europe for 100 years. And the war will slow down considerably, and sort of stalemate will happen. These fortified dug-ins or trenches, think of the Western Front, the same thing. And that will run for about a year, I expect, and Western politicians will tell their people the war has stalemated, and NATO countries will tell their people, we have triumphed, we saved Kiev, we saved Ukraine from Russian aggression, and we have won. And the Russians will be able to say, we have saved the land bridge to Crimea, we've saved the port at Sevastopol, which Russian strategists believe was the trigger of the war to begin with, which they say they would defend it. And we have saved ethnic Russians from what they would describe as persecution by the Ukrainians. And if you are familiar with the recent diplomatic history of that region, you'll know about the Minsk Accords that was about just more than a decade old. And these were agreements that were broken several times to try and build, in a sense, a buffer zone in allowing the eastern ethnic Russian portion of Ukraine to exist as a quasi-autonomous region, but still under the authority of Kiev. The agreements there were that just so you see how this will play out, the troops will pull back 5 kilometers, the people with rifles, and the heavy weapons will pull back 30 kilometers. And there'll be a sort of demilitarized zone in the middle that will be guarded by some diplomatic agreement. And this time, the East is not going to be under the autonomy of Kiev. The East is going to be under the autonomy of itself, or of Russia, in practice under Russian authority. And I think of timing, early 2025, first, second quarter, following the November election in the US, this conflict will be settled along those lines, which it should have been done 12 years ago on the Minsk lines. And these parties have fought themselves onto, not exactly, but very close to the Minsk Accord agreement lines. And I think on the Russian side, that's been done intentionally. If they can dig in there, stalemate this war, and it's over. For us, that's important because there'll be less opportunity for blundering on our own foreign policy in a manner that potentially sufficiently agitates exuberant congressmen in Washington to propose taking firm economic trade action against South Africa, which is something that I will tell you, in my opinion, is strongly opposed by the American administration in Washington this time.
So Frans, if I could, big question.
I know this question's afterwards, just the situation in America at the moment is very polarized with the Republicans and the Democrats with the election that's looming. If you talk about exuberant congressmen, do you think is it leaning more towards the Republican side? And what the effect of that could be if a Trump gets back into presidency?
Well, it's okay. That's yeah. So there's a big question. Trump's polling strongly at the moment. He's hands down beating DeSantis. I was there for the previous election, and the joke was there were people in Washington who didn't know there were Trump supporters in America, and that stretched onto the Republican side of the equation as well. So who knows what he will do? He did possess. Oddly, these things are often lost. I think the quality of a lot of our broader media has deteriorated sharply because Trump possessed a very interesting team on South Africa. The National Security Advisor, a man called Robert O'Brien, he'd been educated at the University of Free State, for example. And Nikki Haley, when she was ambassador to the UN, had a very astute series of observations on South Africa, and there were others as well. And I think that astuteness, more astute than my experience of many American diplomats over the last 20 years, is sufficiently strong to realize that the American position and the Western position in Africa and Southern Africa has worsened dramatically. And any action now that would push South Africa deeper into Russia's orbit, particularly given the South Atlantic, presents a national security threat to the US. So I'd anticipate that even on that, look, there's the Trump side of Congress, which is one thing. Then within the American Congress, there are also a few hot heads which sit on the extreme fringes. And those are the ones that there's perhaps some concern around now. But they're totally distinct from the core Trump administration people who often were very, very good. The people, the bureaucrats, some of them were superb in their time in his administration. So I think regardless of how it plays out in November of next year, the realization in the West is that if you you don't have many levers to pull in Africa anymore if you're a Western government to exert strategic influence. What are you going to do? You don't have many soft power levers left. You don't have much media reach and influence. China and South African media is very well positioned. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the US means that you cannot engage in some of the sort of nefarious tactics that might be open to Russian and Chinese investors. And that disables one further. So I think, again, that contrary to the sort of, short of some sort of hysteria on South Africa taking, a congressman, an aide told me once, the worst thing your country could do, this was before this stuff, is to alert congressmen to the fact that it exists. Stay nice and quietly under the radar, you'll be fine. Now, our diplomatic blunders of late, which I've described as, have achieved the opposite effect. We've made front page, a Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, there we are. And the storyline, the inference, is you're arming the Russians to attack the Ukrainians. You can't, there is no greater affront to liberal Western sensitivities at the moment than that accusation. So these are terrible foreign affairs blunders. But I don't think the blunders accurately reflect the foreign policy intent of the South African government. And I think in the West there's a better understanding of this. And I think even if Trump comes to power, we'll have a far more strategic approach on South Africa. And the idea of us being cut off from the West and told, bugger off and fend for yourselves, that translates immediately into a greater security concern for Washington. I don't think it's going to happen.
So if I could summarize there, France, it's a nuanced, complex scenario, as they all are. But it's valuable as a country that we remain neutral, as far as possible.
I would recommend neutrality, of course. I think that is valuable. I think in the pursuit of national interest. But we're not neutral, and you know, the real world is, reality is the thing that's still there even when you stop believing it. And the real world reality that Western diplomats are starting to understand is that the ANC is quite sincere about its relationship with Russia. And it's not going to back off from whatever the advantages of doing so might not be. So that's baked in. So even despite that, our neutrality is biased towards Russia. You can see that in our voting record in the United Nations. It's quite a good indicator. You can see how often does South Africa, it's called the voting coincidence factor. Do we vote the same as other emerging markets on critical issues with the United States? And not a recent thing. For in the early first 5 years after 94, the voting coincidence factor was higher than it has been for the past 20 years. So neutrality would be advised, but we're not going to have clear neutrality. So let's have the position that we currently have without the blunders which cause such damage. Western diplomats will, I think, begin to accede to that, understand it. And the upshot for me is that it's unlikely that the dire economic consequences, look, it's very damaging to the economy, it's not without that. Perception, sentiment, all of that, very bad. But the catastrophic economic consequences that are inferred in some of our media reporting that will attach themselves to our relationship with Russia, I think is greatly exaggerated and will unlikely materialize as catastrophic consequences.
Okay, maybe that's a great segue into sort of, we've thought about world politics and some of the movements there. Kevin, leading up to next year's local election, South African governmental elections, do you see any sort of changes to policies, or we're going to unpack the load shedding or lack thereof problem in due course? But in terms of running up to next year's elections, you mentioned we might be peaking in terms of interest rate hikes. Do you see any sort of ramped up spending on infrastructure coming or that sort of thing?
Yeah, I do. I think that it would be, there's a tendency, most governments around the world and in South Africa, there's a tendency to try and beautify things ahead of an election. So you run around spending some money, delivering services. That's kind of natural. And I don't think that necessarily starts now. I think that's too long a lead time. You want to make an impact where you are upping your game and you are being more diligent in the provision of services where you've got much more proximity to the actual election. So I think you'll get that. And that's helpful. It helps, it boosts confidence a bit, there's a bit of spending. It's not necessarily sincere, but it gives you some economic activity. At the same time, you'll probably have, going into the election, you've got a lot of political parties now, I don't know how many, but like a lot. And all of them are going to be spending a bit of money, some t-shirts, some advertising, some posters, and in an economy that's growing at 0.1%, that helps actually. That gives you a little bit of a boost in activity. And if at the same time you're cutting interest rates, that will give you a bit of relief. The infrastructure side, there's steady progress. So it's not as if I think there's going to be a radical ramp up in infrastructure. I think there are various projects that are in the pipeline, and some of them maybe will try and accelerate and get some of those going. And I think that over time, you'll see some of these projects being implemented. I do think there will be quite a big effort to sort out power. And I think the government will get lucky. By that I mean, I think that you can bring back the units at Kusile by the end of the year, the ones that are broken. I think there are 4 units that are in need of repair. You can bring them back. The Medupi Unit 4, when I last looked, they said August next year, but I think they've accelerated that rebuild or that fix, if you like. So you could bring back Medupi and you could bring back Kusile by the middle of next year. And if you think there's not much load shedding now, those units would give you 3,000, 4,000 megawatts, right? And so you could scale back load shedding quite a bit as you build up to the election. That would be very helpful for the government. There is an effort underway to help local government. Now, the way that the National Treasury is approaching it, I don't think is going to work, but you can see the intent. They've done two things. One is they've created an incentive for local government to write off the debt that they owe Eskom. So local governments owe Eskom 57 billion rand, and National Treasury has come up with a scheme. And the scheme is, if you do this, a list of criteria, which basically means you collect more money and you pay the money for Eskom. You do that, and we will write off your debt that you owe Eskom in 3 tranches over the next 3 years. And the thought behind it, I think, is, geez, we've got to sort out local government. And that's a good thing. I don't think all the municipalities are going to take them up on this incentive, right? But it's a good thing. And the other thing is they put municipalities now under pressure to up their game when it comes to water quality and sanitation. And I listened to the press conference, and there was a discussion about taking municipalities to court if they don't fulfill this objective, right? Because this is government taking government to court, which sounds bizarre, but there is a constitutional right to some of these things. And so I think you've seen government put pressure on local authorities. So you could create an environment where all of this comes together at once. You're getting cuts in interest rates, you're getting less load shedding, you're getting some beautification of the environment, you've got parties running around printing posters, and you've got much better economic growth. And I think that's exactly what we're going to get. And so it will feel better. And I think you'll feel that better when we get into this summer, right? You've got to get past the winter, get into the summer, and I think initially there will be sort of some enthusiasm. The question for me is, post the election, right? Now we've done the election, who's in charge, who's the cabinet? Can we make real change? We haven't done that yet. This is kind of plastering over some of the cracks, make it look better, give us a bit of an uplift, a cut in interest rates, all of that helps. But there are big structural issues that we've got to deal with. And I don't see those on the table. There's also the risk that you kind of err a little bit on the populist side, and you come up with some populist policies and some rhetoric around that, and whether NHI is part of that, you can debate, but that's a risk. You feel the need to add to this, or we're going to do something good, and you come up with stuff that actually doesn't result in a good outcome. But I think it gets better from here. I think we're at the point of maximum pessimism in South Africa for the moment.
So interesting point you made there, that there's a lot of activity, particularly at local government, to try and enhance service delivery, improve the state of Eskom. For the large part of the ANC's rule, they've been characterized by inaction.
Oh yes.
And someone remarked once to me under Zuma, the best thing that they did was just do nothing. So they didn't roll out NHI, they didn't roll out land appropriation, etc. And arguably that would have been way more disastrous. And so why now? Like, just maybe France, could you link action on a local service delivery level, action on Eskom, with ultimately what the ANC wants is votes? So what's turned that corner?
Firstly, the context is that, I'm answering your question. 94, the ANC gets 63% of the vote. And a decade later, in 2004, it's almost 70. It's gone up. That's remarkable, because 94 was liberation, Mandela leading South Africa. Why isn't it stronger a decade later? And I sort of started doing this stuff by then, and sort of B-stream analysts cooked up the idea of liberation royalty voting to explain this. And elite circles were so keen on the ANC, denied it. They thought, well, and what liberation royalty voting meant is that, in practice, ANC voters are incapable of reasoned, logical thought. They just vote for the ANC because that's what they do. They vote in cattle. And they'll do this forever, and we are stuck with that. And I was a member then, a junior member of a team of analysts, and we thought this just doesn't work. Voter behaviour around it was always logical and reasonable, even if you struggle to find it first. And we developed a second thesis, which was that support for the ANC is rising because life in South Africa is getting a lot better. And this was in the era of jobless growth and failed service delivery. And we discovered, where's Joy doing this? We discovered that in the first decade as a democracy, South Africa doubles the number of people with employment. It goes from 7.5 to 14 million, almost doubles. And still today in South Africa's business press, you will read, your clients read about jobless growth under Thabo Mbeki. It's crap. It never happened. On service delivery, on our first evening as a democracy, we all went to bed, 50% of family units went to bed without an electrical connection to their homes. In 2004, that was 20%. And there were no emerging markets, and I've sustained this argument for a long time, that can compete with the scale of the service delivery successes secured by the ANC and government in its first decade ago. And today you read about service delivery failures still of that era, which explains it. And many other. Do you know that in the Mandela Mbeki era, South Africa built 10 formal houses for every one new shack that was erected in the country? And the upshot of all of this, and answering your question, is ANC voters were not voting on liberation loyalty voting. They were voting on their material circumstances, which is what voters do all around the world, all the time, everywhere. Sometimes it's a bit of a lag time. And you might have, if you did some sort of not very good polling, you might have asked ANC voters, why are you doing this? And ANC voters might have said, because we were liberated from oppression by the ANC, but that was not, the reason ANC voters have the luxury of holding that position, and the very high quality polling data showed this, was because of the joy and relief at the socio-economic liberation that was happening in the country. In 1991, 43 whites got a degree in engineering for every black graduate. And by the end of Mbeki's era, there are more black than white engineering graduates. And the number of whites isn't less than it had been at the beginning. So I'm very good. I was once accused of being better at this kind of propaganda than Mac Maharaj, and I enjoyed that. It was true. What that means for the present position that we're in is ANC is, last year, the Social Research Foundation is a policy group that I chair the board of. It does a lot of serious opinion work. Last year we had the ANC through the year on a turnout scenario, some data model for an election turnout, at 47, 48, 49%, with a margin of error of 1.7%, on the threshold. This year we've had them at just above 50, got them at 52. So they are clinging on, fingernail stuff. But the reason they've slipped vastly, I mean, some of my clients say, well, why are they there at all? I thought they were at 30%. They're at 50, and 50 is a collapse in ANC support. The collapse is most visible when you get under the surface and start to disaggregate the vote. In urban areas, this is extraordinary. If an election were held today, the ANC would get 30%. It has lost the aspirant emerging urban middle class permanently. It's irrevocable. They will never get it back. In rural South Africa, the number is closer to 70%. So that rural market holds the ANC artificially at near 50. And the rural voter is making a logical and reasoned decision, because it's an older demographic of a less skilled, poorer person who has living memory experience of growing up black during apartheid in rural South Africa, and relative to the current mayhem that we experience in the traffic. That outweighs everything else. But that rural market for the ANC is going to erode over the next decade at a combination of the mortality rate, which is older demographic, and the urbanization rate, which is totally unstoppable. You can't do anything about that. And nor should you do anything about it. So ANC support is going to be pulled lower and lower and lower over the decade. And the reason for that, the primary driver of all voter behavior in the country, is the material circumstances of the individual. And therefore, even though, I mean, you ended on a fairly optimistic note, it sounded sort of as optimistic as I am, that we're not, I don't think we're at the point of collapse or cataclysm or anything of that. We're an emerging market in deep trouble, but that's as far as it goes. It could be very much worse. The fact that we're not going to see much by way of sustained growth. There's an inbuilt kind of counter to that in our politics. We became a free society, so that if we get into this position and living standards no longer improve, people will have an avenue to change the system and government, which is what they're doing. There's no need to look far and wide for a reform movement. Where is it? What's business doing? Is it enough? The reform movement is the country's people who are moving very fast. That urban number I gave, who are moving extremely quickly towards a new kind of administration. This is why we became a free society. And when I have this to and fro with clients and they say you're overly optimistic, I say there aren't many emerging markets who they got into the trouble we're in now, low growth, etc., could change administration through a ballot box peacefully. In many of the cases, the change had to happen through coercion and violence, either violent revolution or something similar. We have it relatively easy here. You must also allow for a bit of a lag time between the lived experience of people and their voting decisions, before I get to the state of the opposition. In some respects, this was actually, we focus group in SRF voters, so you get them around the table, they've got something in common, you do a structured conversation. You study that to get sort of qualitative sense of data, a qualitative sense of information that you can read against quantitative political data. And we have a lot of this stuff. No one in the country has as much. We've got thousands of data points of each voter in the country. We really understand it well. And there is sometimes the question put to me, but if you look at the state of the place falling apart, 50% youth unemployment, no water in Melbourne, how can the ANC be at 50? In focus groups with ANC voters on this point, a person, which is more than one, has used the analogy of someone in an abusive relationship. And the way to think of it, if you expand that analogy a bit, is that there's this sort of this initial period of euphoria through the transition, the sort of wedding, everyone's very happy. Then there's 10 years of real success. And life is great, the relationship's wonderful. And that's really important to understand the success of the ANC in the first decade. Because a lot of analysts' departure point on South Africa, with it I'm saying, public, is that it's been a bit of a disaster for 30 years. And these are the chickens coming home to roost. It hasn't been. 15 really quite good years. I mean, we had a budget surplus in the middle of all of this. Amazing. Used the saving on the interest bill of the debt rate, which was cut in half to finance the rollout of the social welfare program. Actually, very brilliant. These voters say that the relationship was wonderful, and then it faded, and of late it's become abusive. And the term, ANC voters use the term abuse. And the ANC brand, ANC voters are more critical of the ANC often than opposition voters, because they care about the ANC and they're so disappointed at its performance. And like an abused spouse or whatever the case is, in a cold, rational moment, that person may tell you, I know this relationship is bad for me, and I know I need to get up. But they stay. Why do they stay? They stay because they're afraid that the man will catch the woman and beat her, or they're afraid that they don't have the resources to sustain themselves outside of the ANC. And when we put to ANC voters, what do you, a lot of things, but what do you, I'll back to the quantitative stuff, what do you believe will happen in the aftermath of an ANC defeat? A significant number say there will be anarchy and violence in the country. And for the relative elites, anarchy and violence, and I'm not downplaying this, you hide out in your Gulf estate and watch it. But if you are a poor South African, it's on the streets. Your shops are looted, you can't get access to medications and the like. The kids are on the street and shot by the police. And there's the echo of the violence of 30 years ago still that exists in our society, and the recent experience of what happened in the town. So there's a real fear inside the ANC base of exit. Second point ANC voters make is that the material circumstances outside of the ANC might not be improved. And if we had the opportunity today to bring in here, let's say, a collection of young South Africans, perhaps the example I use, you live on a shack on a sand dune outside Cape Town. And we had the leaders of all our political parties here. We said, here's this chap, lives in this shack, his life's truly terrible. Could any of those politicians convince that guy, which this is what they have to do, to win this race, that if you vote for me and my guys, it is very likely that I will get you out of that shack within 5 years. And they couldn't do it. And therefore, that if the ANC is losing support on the one hand, doing everything in its power to commit political suicide. But on the other hand, you need to vote for something else. And the experience that some of us who live times in Johannesburg have had of the coalition government here, I mean, I suppose you've had that experience. But we polled it, and 70% of township voters in Gauteng said they noticed no difference or improvement in how the city was governed when the coalition took it over. So what on earth is going to cause ANC voters, remember the abuse spouse analogy, to exit? But, and then, I'll come ask you questions in detail. There is inside the ANC base, there's a third that wants to go. It's very clear, it stands out every time, every poll, want to exit. The desire to go. They're no longer ANC supporters, they're ANC voters, that can be distinguishing feature. And if our collective opposition finds it within itself to stop working against each other. Now, I've seen some of these negotiations up close. I must tell you, even now, I've never seen anything like this. The vindictive malice is frightening in the opposition ranks. Not everyone, some players are really positive, but the relationships are so toxic. If the opposition can learn to work together, which is the most positive political sentiment in the country, if you want to motivate a voter, people don't vote on pessimism, they vote on what they hope to achieve. The most positive line you can put out to voters is we will stop working against each other, we will start working with each other, even with the ANC, to make our life better. And at the same time, inculcate the realistic belief that life will get better. If the broader opposition does that, the bulk of that third of the ANC base would exit. Now that's a third of 50% of the vote, so let's say it's 15%. Let's say 2/3 of that exits, that's 10, that means the ANC is at 40. When the ANC is at 40, we will have serious negotiations about a future coalition government. And that is an inflection point. That's the country's reform horizon. I've got a reputation over the past 15 years of being a bit bearish on something, but it was often right. And I'm now more bullish on it because that inflection point is in sight. Inflection points in politics are so amazing. You don't, unless you're in the field, you don't understand the power that they have. They become the excuse for incumbent governments to back out of policies that they are pursuing but don't wish to pursue. And if the inflection point of this coalition coincides with some relief on load shedding, better understanding about South Africa's place in the world, you add these factors together, you can actually make the case that there are prospective upsides for the country, not guaranteed, it's still stuff to say if we want to, but there are prospective upsides that a lot of my clients generally don't see.
Okay, so some strategy team at the ANC has said we can put a significant amount of effort behind resolving load shedding, and that's going to pay off for us. If it does pay off, it's our most likely bet.
Well, early in the year, polls said of ANC voters, if lights are out in the next election, 40% of ANC voters said, I will seriously reconsider my choices. And a quarter of the 40s, 10% of the total, said, I'll never vote for these guys now, if the lights are out. And that lit a fire under the ox of the party. But something more important, now here's a statement too. Corruption has not been the primary reason for load shedding in the country. It is a contributing reason and a terrible one. It's caused great damage. The primary reason for load shedding is wrong-headed policy. That we have moved away from our coal fleet far too fast to replace it with viable alternatives. And why the lights are on again now is through this year, but particularly through the last several months, and accelerated by the departure of Mr. De Ruyter, the Cabinet has decided that the refitment and delayed decommissioning of coal should be a policy priority for the country. And that is how we ultimately are approaching it. There are 50,000 roughly megawatts of generating capacity in the country, so power stations roughly, and we produce about half of that in electricity every day, a little bit less, 24,000 megawatts. 1,000 megawatts is one stage of load shedding. So if load shedding is at stage 3 and we're producing 23,000, had we produced 26,000, in theory there wouldn't be load shedding. 50,000 in total, we produced 25 with load shedding stage 3. Of the 50,000, about 45,000 is coal, old and new coal. And of that 45, just more than a third works and generates electricity. It's about, depends on the day. In February it was 17,000. The lights are on at the moment because that figure's moved closer to 20,000 a day. Into the longer term, past the next 12 months, if the Cabinet remains focused on the priority, which might not be the declared priority in our trade system, the priority of refitting the coal fleet. You take 1/3 of the defunct coal fleet, so 1/3 of the coal fleet, 15,000 megawatts, refitted. Engineers at Eskom, we speak very anonymously, and others who were there previously, say how this works is you power stations from the building, and inside there's sort of boilers and pipes and things to make electricity. Send in an engineering team to audit that stuff. Doesn't matter how old the plant is. They said some of the oldest plants are solid. Take the blueprints and you see what pipes and valves and so on there are. And you, the engineers say this is missing, this has been hacked off and sold for scrap metal, and this is what holes in. You reorder those parts from the original equipment manufacturer or from someone who makes it. And you put them back into the plants, and as the chap put it to me, line it up and it's going to work. It's not going to be pretty, it's going to be probably the most polluting objects on the earth. But we will buy ourselves at a coal capacity factor of 70%, about 10 or 11,000 megawatts. It's doable within 3 years if you do it properly, 5 years if you do it efficiently. And it is much cheaper than trying to build a new power station. It works further because it aligns with South Africa's electrical grid. The grid is built to run from the south to the north of the country, from the coal fields into the urban areas. There is vast surplus grid capacity running from the south to the north. There is zero surplus grid capacity running from the west to the east, so from the zones of high solar radiation into the east. I believe there's a New York Times story yesterday actually about how grid capacity constraints are going to undermine American attempts at renewables. The refitment strategy is popular in the government now because it's cheap, it's fast. You don't need to build another power station. You don't need to add any grid capacity. And if you do the refitment together with a lot of anticipated green and other initiatives, perhaps build another gas turbine too, buy enough diesel, the amazing result is that on a 10-year view, we estimate that you generate enough electricity from an energy perspective to sustain economic growth rates of 3, 4, and over 5%, just from an energy perspective. To do that, and to get back to your point, you need a whole host of other policy reforms, and they are not going to happen. So we're not going to get back to 3 or 4 or 5% growth in the short term. Those policy reforms, the horizon to start anticipating those, is at that inflection point where ANC support is down closer to 40%. It's forced to find partners to negotiate a deal around. Part of that deal will be these kinds of policy reforms. And many in the ANC striking those agreements will be relieved that a moment has been reached where they have the political justification to make what appear to be concessions towards policies that enable higher levels of growth because they understand, they truly do, that their political future in the country and the performance of its economy are so linked and intertwined that if we remain a low growth society for the next 10 to 20 years, the ANC's political prospects are very poor could, to an extent, almost evaporate entirely from our society.
France, some controversial statements there. And I think it's worth our audience just digesting those. And while they do, Kevin, just sort of, if France is going to, well, not France personally, but if France's theories come true and the government can get its act together to generate some electricity and you get some growth and then we can do some stuff with the money. It seems that the Reserve Bank and sort of the way we balance our budget is actually quite fiscally responsible.
Sure.
It's small tweaks here and there.
Yep.
And so maybe just take us through, I know it's well ahead of time, it's still next year, but what are some of the characteristics you would see in an election year budget? Because obviously they've got their own election. So what's some things we might see and might there be some red herrings? So for example, I know there's the two-part retirement reform that seems to be coming to pass. NHI has reared its head again. They seem to have backed off on land expropriation, but maybe just some comments on next year's budget.
So I think that I'm not expecting to see a radical change in government spending where National Treasury says we're going to become populist in order to try and secure the election. I don't think Enoch will do that. I don't think National Treasury will do that. I think they will stick to what they regard as their longer term mandate, which is restore fiscal discipline. That doesn't mean that you can't, at the edges, tinker with some ideas and put forward some initiatives. And maybe, if you want to be populist, you put forward some proposals, but it doesn't mean it goes ahead. And you kind of get this allure that you're going to be doing something, you win the election, but you never actually get it done. And in truth, there's very little that the government could announce and implement in time for the actual election, right? So I think at a budget level, there is going to be slippage. There is already some slippage. That slippage is you've got some tax revenue under pressure because the economy is only growing at 0.1%. And yes, the mining revenue is holding up, but the domestic revenue, VAT receipts, we can already see that there's some slippage there. And that slippage will probably continue. So you've got a bit of a difficulty that your windfall out of tax revenue is not quite what it was in the previous 2 years. And the second is you're spending already over budget. And that expenditure is partly because you gave more salary increases and partly because the social payment system is big and it's growing. And there are lots of people that need to get onto that system because you're not creating enough jobs. And there will be some additional spending that happens, of course. Various projects get initiated as you get closer to the election. And so I think that you're going to find the minister in October saying, we didn't quite make our numbers. This primary budget surplus we've been talking about, it's not going to quite be there. But the intention is still to be disciplined. And I think come February next year, I think you'll see the same thing. You'll see, it's a little bit of slippage, we're not quite there, but going forward, we intend to put this on the correct footing. And one of the key motivators to do that is simply the cost of finance, right? The level of government debt is over 70% of GDP. The interest cost of that debt is over 20% of government's tax revenue. So you're spending a fortune on the interest cost. And if you don't follow this disciplined rhetoric, then that interest cost is likely to get worse, and it's already getting worse. In which case, the Minister of Finance knows that if you come up with a populist policy, you're probably going to push away foreign investors, local investors. You probably are going to end up with sticky inflation more than you need. The bond yield goes higher, the cost of finance goes higher. It's just disastrous. So I think that National Treasury will adhere to the basic mandate. Try and be disciplined from here. So I'm not expecting anything radical. I'm thinking stuff at the margin that beautifies the place and a bit of service delivery. But it does set up a very difficult debate going forward if you want the higher growth rate. And we have to, the 3, 4, 5%. Because, I don't know how much time I've got, but just very quickly, if you want to grow a country, any country, no matter where you are, you need a balance sheet. And in every country, there's only 3 balance sheets. Every country has 3 balance sheets. You need one of them, at least, to be powerful and available. So what are those 3 balance sheets? The first is your household balance sheet. In South Africa, that's not powerful, and because we don't save a lot of money. And what it means is if we wanted to use the household balance sheet, we would say to people, go out and shop. Go out and shop, and gee, while you're at it, use some credit. And you can boost an economy doing that. And probably there are very few countries who could do it. China could do it if they wanted to right now. It's not a sustainable long-term strategy, but you can leverage a household balance sheet for a period of time. Not possible in South Africa. We quickly run into problems. The second balance sheet is your government balance sheet, which is what most countries use to try and get your growth going. And we had that, as Frans was saying, back in 2009. 2009, government debt was 23, 24% of GDP. Unbelievably low. South Africa was an A-rated country by Moody's. Credit rating A, right? Trevor Manuel was moved out of Minister of Finance to go planning. At that point, government balance sheet was incredibly powerful, and South African government could spend money on anything they wanted, anything. It would not have raised an eyebrow. All they had to do was decide, what are we going to spend the money on? In the end, they made some really bad choices, right? So government debt is now at 70-odd%. Credit rating is 2 notches below investment grade. We're junk status, we're grey listed. You do not have a government balance sheet that you can leverage. You cannot grow the South African economy leveraging the government balance sheet. There isn't a tax base, there isn't the room in terms of debt. So you're left with one balance sheet, and that balance sheet is the corporate balance sheet. And thank goodness, South African corporate balance sheet is incredibly strong. And you don't find that everywhere. If you go to many other emerging markets, you've got a wrecked corporate balance sheet. They run with way too much debt. So African corporates are incredibly conservative, run by chartered accountants who worry about the balance sheet, worry about the cash. These are a group of people. We watched the data during COVID. COVID started, right? And many South African large corporates went to the bank and borrowed more money. You could see it in the data. And we said, why are you borrowing more money? What are you going to spend the money on? You know what they did with the money? They put it in the bank as cash. And we asked why, just in case. Just in case what? No, just in case. It's like buying toilet paper during COVID. I don't know why we did that, but I think it was just in case, right?
I can see that in the headlines tomorrow. Corporate equivalent of buying toilet paper.
So we are hoarding cash at the moment in corporates. That is a balance sheet, and a balance sheet that could be leveraged. And so that's the only way forward. If you want the 3-4%, you genuinely want that, you can only achieve that if you allow the corporate balance sheet to get leveraged, to engage, which means what? By definition, government has to get out of the way. And therein lies the obstacle. Government is incredibly reluctant to get out of the way. And they do get out of the way, but they get out of the way only at the point of a crisis, right? Or electricity is a crisis, let's get out of the way. Pier 2 harbour in Durban. People say it's the worst harbour in the world. It's not. It's technically the 6th worst harbour in the world. There are about 400 harbours that are surveyed. So now government's getting out the way. It's going to hand over Pier 2 harbour to a private sector operator. So government does get out the way, but only at the point of collapse. Not good enough. So that's the real debate. Beyond this uplift that I think we're going to get over the next year or two, I think the economy feels better. We breathe easier. We've got some electricity. I think confidence will go up. But the structural gain has to involve leveraging the private sector balance sheet.
Can I put a second on this?
Yeah.
Just the discipline point that Kevin made is, I find that there are things today that are taken for granted, and that we're a free society is one, and we have vibrant opposition is another, and a number of others, and we actually do desire decent relations. But if you were a homicidal kind of Marxist revolutionary administration, you would facing political defeat, which the ANC faces now. You would print money. That's what you do. Again, the reason you do it, you want to create inflation. Because by inflation you create poverty and desperation, and you harness that to populism in order to steamroller over democratic institutions and protections. And the fact that this is not happening has a much wider importance about it's not clear. Like my trying to explain South Africa's position on Russia and the West to you, I didn't make it clear because it's not. Too many analysts make the world so neat and tidy for their clients to understand. It's not like that. And there's a lot in the South African government that's decrepit and counterproductive. But that the streak of fiscal prudence runs through is broadly representative of elements of pragmatism that we must be immensely grateful for. It is so important to understand that these guys can lose an election. They know that. They're not printing money, not throwing it at the civil service grants more than they want to make. I mean, the minister even tried to pursue a primary budget surplus, which you won't achieve. Running into an election his party could lose. It's a very important nuance that needs to be brought. I would recommend it. Sort of nuance that you bring into your equations when you're advising a client about the likely long-term prognosis.
We sometimes take our liberal freedoms for granted. The opposition are not being thrown in jail, and we're allowed to get up on stage and criticize both the ANC and the opposition.
I use that with, I say to you, I've been sometimes you come across very, with good reason, depressed individual preferred. And this is one of the points we actually make, that a very big problem would be if we were having this meeting in Hampstead this morning, and you asked me if there was any prospect of getting opposition leader X, whoever in favour is, out of prison, where he was, like the Venezuelan opposition at the moment. That would be a huge problem. If you asked me how we could, or asked Kevin how we could tame our sort of 500,000% inflation rate, that would be a very big problem. Or whether there's a chance that some revolutionary movement could overthrow the government so that we could, these are huge, these are typical, enormous emerging market problems. We don't have those. Ours are very serious, and the consequences for people who are poor are devastating, but they are quite easily manageable and fixable. And I think that's the important nuance just to bring into some of the discussion on the country when it threatens to lurch over the cliff and say that we are doomed.
Thanks, Franz, Kevin. So we're going to step into question time in a few minutes. So please get your questions ready. We've trod the path of likely outcomes with reference to next year's election. Maybe if you could, Franz, just speculate on, perhaps at the moment, somewhat unlikely, but what if the ANC gets 45%?
It can get 45. It's just on the fringes of the margins of error. That's a possible result. For the ANC to lose, if you want to lose, if you're an opposition strategist, you must remove Mr. Ramaphosa. Very popular in ANC ranks today still. It must be dark. And the opposition must work together very effectively and use Gauteng as a blueprint of what life will be like under an opposition government, which they have regrettably done. So the ANC is pretty secure. If it's at 45, a whole lot of deal making happens. And the number one theory that's cast around the mainstream that you should take seriously is the ANC hooks up with the EFF and they do very dangerous populist things that they sort of last to become a failed state. That's could happen. But there are some riders that you must weigh up to consider the likelihoods. Number one is you're the ANC, you're at 45. Are you going to invite into your camp the most ruthless political opponents that you have ever created within the country? Because inside serious ANC ranks, that's described as a reverse takeover. And you lose. Your alternative is you've got all sorts of small proxy parties that are kind of ANC sympathetic, Al-Jamaa, AIC, bits of the PAC and so on, that lost their way from what their very honourable tradition of 30, 40 years ago was. You can get all these little guys in and you can give them sort of ministerial posts and votes, and they put you in power. That's a more likely, that's a more rational choice that you make. Then, when you consider that, you've got to consider provincial maths now, because this is where the action is at. The ANC is going to be 35 in Gauteng. It's way down. The EFF could be under 15. That means the ANC-EFF national deal means that Gauteng is denied to the ANC. They're also going to lose KZN and cities, and they've lost the Western Cape. If the ANC loses its access to Gauteng, that accelerates the trajectory I earlier alluded to of the ANC becoming a rural party of older people. Later, that will force it to become a regional party to Northwest Limpopo and Mpumalanga. Will have its last conference under the Thorn Tree on the Botswana border, talking about when we govern Southern Africa. And really sharp ANC strategists are saying we've lost in our own right the aspirant middle class urban Scot. To retain access to that vote, we need to make deals with parties that inspire that same vote. That's the Gauteng. In Natal, ANC is falling quickly, party's climbing quickly. We're going to test that in great detail in a few months' time. It's very difficult to poll Natal. Before you send some kid from Bishops around asking people who they want to vote for. It's just very difficult to do. But there's definitely a surge of Inkatha. A deal then becomes, because remember the EFF ANC is the assured deal, definitely going to happen, so we are completely doomed. That deal becomes the ANC gives Natal to the IFP, says you can run it as you choose. And in exchange, we want a confidence and support agreement. Now, this is a level of agreement far short of an alliance or a coalition. And this you must understand too. It's not just all about we're in 1/10 of the coalition. Confidence and support agreements are more likely in a 45% ANC world next year than coalitions. And what it means is the confidence side is we will oppose at national level all votes of no confidence in your president for the sake of stability. And support is we will support you to get the budget through Parliament. So the ANC with IFP and some of the smaller proxies does confidence and support at the national level, and Carter runs the town. Third piece of information to consider is the Western Cape. It is not, the DA can lose the Western Cape faster than the ANC loses the country. The DA is at about, let's say, high 50s in the Western Cape. But the demographics are different. 19% of the Western Cape is white, 50% is coloured, and 30% is black. And the reason the DA governs the Western Cape and the ANC before them is that they split the coloured vote between them. And because they've been a bit dozy on strategy, the assumption existed in South African politics. Everyone knows you win an election in the Western Cape by winning the coloured vote. But the assumption was the coloured vote splits between the DA and the ANC. Not enough thought was given to what happens if you see an upsurge of coloured nationalism, which has never happened before, seriously. Now you have a candidate like Gates McKenzie. You must take him very seriously. People tend to deride him. He has a checkered past, prison gang leader, robber, all manner of things. But he is the most capable political operator that I've known. If you ask him what is the purpose of politics, which you might not answer correctly, because you're not in the field, he's one of the only South African politicians who's told me the accumulation and application of power. If you ask the nice little liberal opposition, they say to make the world a better place and fix the potholes and create jobs and so on, which is nice. But it's not the ruthlessness that McKenzie possesses. He is doing a lot of the right things, such as reading serious economics and philosophy at the moment, which was something he didn't have the opportunity to do in his youth. On the campaign trail in the Cape, if he can replicate what he's been doing in some ward elections, in Barrydale, stunning results, huge figures. Last week in Karukama on the outskirts of PE, in coloured ward, massive result for him. If he does that, he takes the DA below 50 in the cap, and he can then make a deal with ANC to get access to the Cape. So this maths becomes incredibly complicated. The desire amongst what the ANC will do, if it's at 45 and above, it will make these little deals. And it will stick to them before it makes an EFF deal. Because the EFF deal is beset with terrible risks for it. That's the likelihood. Once after that, once the slide continues for the ANC, if we remain a free society, which it will, because we're not going to grow fast enough to avert that, and that's the primary driver of voting behaviour. Once we start getting the ANC down to 40 and into the 30s, one of the deals that becomes prospective is DA-ANC together, because both of them collectively loathe the idea of 1-2% parties telling them who's going to be the mayor and the finance minister. And they are not as far apart from each other as people think, which is why I stressed, anticipating this question, the fiscal stuff in the ANC. The ANC also has experience of government, like we see on fiscal. And they're fantastic people in the ANC, great, and they're great people in the DA and the broader opposition. We're not hammering them. But there is a shallowness within our opposition and in the DA, meaning that it is not prepared or experienced or expert enough to run a country. Cannot do it. And running the Metropole of Cape Town brilliantly, like the brilliant Cape Town Mayor Jordan Lewis does, is a different order of magnitude to running a country. And the ANC EFF deal, and the ANC DA deal, therefore works in the longer term pretty well. It's also the most popular deal amongst voters. Ask people, what do you want the most? DA voters like it for various reasons. ANC voters like it for various reasons as well. So at 45, which is your question, the likelihood is you'll see the scramble for these fractional parties to put together an ANC administration. That is probably what's going to happen next year, if the ANC is there. Beyond that, ANC is going to sink further, another 5-10 points in the next election. And then these bigger deals become more likely. Let's say it's ANC EFF, you might be thinking that, I don't think he's avoiding this, but it's the end of the world. If it's ANC EFF, I don't think that's an end of the world deal either. Because let's pretend that the ANC EFF collective is as bad as the worst prognosis you've read about. And they seek to destroy everything and turn us into a Russian protest. To achieve that, they've got 5 years. And in those 5 years, they've got to remove the fiscal prudence, firstly, get inflation, probably do that. You've got to remove the constitutional edifice and the rule of law. And you're going to run into our battle-hardened civil society guys who fought off state capture to a degree, fought off EWC to a degree, fought off a hell of a lot of other things. And if these guys are well-resourced, it's very difficult to do. You've also got to beat in the ANC EFF team the driver of political behaviour, which is the material circumstances of people. So you're going to start an assault against the constitutional edifice. Sentiment's going to run deeply negative, growth goes under zero for that era. And if you haven't beaten civil society and taken the country to a point where in 2029 we don't have a free election, get to that point, have one more free election. The EFF ANC collective on the data, the collective is down to between 30 and 40%. So I think it's an EFF ANC is as terrible as some people suggest it could be. They try to do their worst. It's a really hard era for us. Bad sentiment, shocking growth numbers, sentiments, bad. But at the end of that, we have this remarkable check and balance in the system, which people will go to vote. And my read of voting data, political behaviour data here for 20 years is on the balance of the evidence, the EFF ANC side will lose that fight in that election. And that will then be the inflection point towards reform.
On that note, question.
Yes. So once you've spoken a long time, so we give Kevin an opportunity. Kevin, this is like a puerile question, but I just wanted to know, first of all, it's like a two-part question, but I'll be quick. Why is it that Reserve Bank governors like Jerome, for argument's sake, doesn't introduce an interest rate hike and wait for the lag? Alternatively, why doesn't he introduce an interest rate hike, for argument's sake, of 2% or 3%, as opposed to having 10 and the 11th is a pause for a month?
Now, it's a fair question. So, why don't you accelerate it very quickly? Why wait around? There's an argument that you know that interest rates are very accommodative. You know that because interest rates are below the inflation rate. You know you've got inflation. You know you're going to have to move interest rates up quite a bit to make a difference. Why don't you just do that in one go? and then wait, right? The argument against doing that is you run a real risk for the US especially of dislocating the financial markets in a very substantial way, in a way that causes panic. And that panic can lead to all kinds of unintended consequences as to how people move money around. And that can include taking money out of banks because you're worried about stability of banks, you're worried about market stability generally. And as a consequence, you create a financial crisis. And the adjustment is too dramatic, too sharp for companies, for asset managers, for a whole group of companies to deal with. And then you get pushback. You get a situation where very powerful people that are in a range of very big financial institutions start to campaign against you. Not a good outcome, because there's a very close working relationship between the Federal Reserve and the major banks. And you don't want to alienate the major banks. So incredibly unlikely to do that because of the shock. It would create too much shock. You've never done it before. It would be difficult to digest. Not going to happen. So then why do you take time to do it? Why not? Or why not maybe hike rates and then give it more time to have an effect? The problem is that along the way, you're trying to move rates up to a level that you think is more or less right. You don't know where that is. You think more or less this. And you're trying to find a path that is between one go and taking 3 years to get there. And most central banks then opt for a path which is pretty much every meeting they'll hike. They keep hiking, which is what the Federal Reserve did. Every meeting you keep hiking. And what you're looking for while you're hiking is that it's working. And as soon as you see it's working, you immediately are, oh, okay, this is working. Now we can finesse the rates. The problem for the Federal Reserve is that it's not clear that it's working. It's working, but it's not clear. You want it to be, this is working. And it's working to the point where you know that it's going to continue to work. And they don't know that. So that's why, and it sounds bizarre, but Canada was very important. So Canada moved rates up pretty much like the US and got to the rate that they thought was the top. And they said, that's it, we're at the top of interest rates, and they paused. And they paused for 4 months, they did nothing. And then they looked at the data and they said, oh my goodness, this isn't working. The inflation number is problematic, housing is coming back, and now they've resumed rate hikes. Not a great outcome, because it says that you didn't read this properly. There's a dent in people's belief that you know what you're doing, right? So let's turn it into medicine. Let's say that you've got a problem and you go to the doctor and the doctor says, well, I can give you these tablets and you could take them all at once. I kill you. So you're going to say, no, doctor, let's not do that. Don't give me all of these tablets all at once, the month's prescription. Let me take this over time. Why does the doctor say that? He's saying your body needs to adjust, the dosage is right for the time, and he's giving you those tablets, right? Then at some point you're going to go back to the doctor, and the doctor's going to say, what he wants to know is, are these tablets working? And you say, well, I'm feeling better. And the doctor says, okay, well, let's stop the tablets. Or let's scale back the prescription. Then you go away, 4 months later you come back and say, I'm still feeling bad. How much confidence do you have in the doctor? Now the doctor says you've got to go back onto your tablets. So it's a confidence game more than anything else. And to be honest, they don't know. They just don't know. They've got the best data in the world, but they don't know. And they're trying to gauge where the right level is. And they make lots of mistakes. And the problem is not mistakes. The problem is you must, as quickly as possible, once you've made a mistake, sort that mistake out. That's the trick to all of this. And so hopefully that's what they do. And they're feeling their way. You can see it. Are we at the top? We might be. Now they're saying, no, we're not quite there yet. The last thing is, it's much easier in interest rate world it's much better to over-tighten than under-tighten. If you're going to make a mistake, which way do you want to make the mistake? Hike rates too much, way better for you. Because you can cut rates very, very quickly. And you can reverse that very quickly, instantaneously. Very few people complain if you cut rates quite a lot. But if you under-tighten, and you give it time, and now you've got to go again. It's like, oh no, man, I thought I was finished with this. No, there's more to come. Then you get that anger and that resentment. So the Fed will err on tightening too much. They'll leave it high for longer, make sure that they've got this inflation rate under control, then relieve the rate pressure.
Great answer, thank you.
Yeah, I guess, Kevin, it's a bit like I've jumped into many hotel showers, and all of them have a very hair's trigger, either scorching hot or freezing cold water.
Yeah.
And so to try and get that balance right is so difficult.
Yeah, and you spend most of the shower just.
Question? Yes.
Just in terms of, I think everyone can hear me.
Yeah.
Just in terms of what's happening with your state-owned enterprises, we seem to be continuously throwing good money after bad. Surely privatization is the way to go with these state-owned enterprises. What's your opinion?
Well, ultimately, that's what we'll have to do. In the interim, there are a few reasons why that doesn't happen. One is patronage. Second is just decision-making generally is very difficult in the ANC. This is underappreciated. The executive committee of the ANC has got 80 ordinary members and several hangers on. Think of it like a board, so 100 people. And the 100 people come from very diverse backgrounds and very diverse interests. They're not always on it. And this 100 needs to come to a firm decision on what to do with the defence contract. Very hard to do. The management structure of the ANC works when it's got a hard line. Mandela was that very brilliant, very ruthless. Worked in exile. Didn't have to take such democratic decisions. Very democratic structure. If your boards that you sit on, companies have an equally democratic structure of leadership and as many directors, you would also be in a bit of a shambles. So that needs to be fixed at some point. Either it needs a hardliner on top, or it needs to fix its management structure. That's the reason why change doesn't happen. Third reason is we haven't hit an inflection point yet that forces that change. And don't think, oh, it's just a thing that happens at the coalition inflection point change. It changes all the rules of the game. Everything is suddenly up for grabs in the give and take negotiation. And you can negotiate away the things you don't want, using a justification, I had to do this to make the deal. And voters are very amenable to deal making. On some of the hottest policy questions, the questions we put to voters, if the deal requires your politician to abandon X, Y, and Z to make a stable coalition, would you support that? I mean, voter opinion is no obstacle to reform-minded thinking in the aftermath of the coalition. So these are the chief reasons. Later, you don't have to privatise it entirely, and sometimes you shouldn't. Competition authorities should watch very closely what happens. But attractive models of booze, build own operate models, be private contractors that build the infrastructure, own it and operate it and contract to the state. And then bots, where you build it, you own it, you transfer it in 40 years' time. So we'll build a railway line, and in 50 years' time we'll give it to government. Then the state gets the feeling that it owns it, it's still in charge. In 50 years' time, when railways anymore, something else. So these are all options, and you mentioned the ports. You know, it's the little embryonic. If you want to anticipate future change, there's a terminology in shipping, I'm told, called twin tabbing. When you turn an oil tank around, it takes very long, very big. It's got a rudder, but because the oil tank is so big and there's such forces involved, you can't turn the rudder. So there's a rudder inside the rudder. It's a little rudder. It turns itself, and then it turns the rudder, and then the rudder turns the oil tank. Watch the little rudder, the twin little tab. Watch the little embryonic science. Kevin talks about ports. Private operators are being brought in. When ideologically obstinate governments, which are all out to this extent, begin to compromise on the heart of the ideology, you can be pretty certain that if pressure continues to be applied to them, they will compromise further and further and further. And I have a sort of sense of personal frustration that I've never helped my clients in 20 years because they've struggled to accept the idea that these small incremental signs can be extrapolated into significant long-term policy and governance implications. And what Kevin told you about in the report is probably a boo or a bot of some sort of description. Others that I'm aware of are boos and bots. And that's what's going to happen with our parastatals if we reach the inflection point that forces the hard deal we make around a future non-EU integration.
Gentleman in the back there.
Kevin, a couple of years ago, going back to the corporate balance sheet, you used to put up a slide that used to show that there was at least almost $1 trillion in bank accounts. So I'd like to know how much is it now, and what are the chances that that saving grace will ever come through from that balance sheet? And the second question is, we see more 30-year-olds or 30-somethings living with their parents.
Yeah.
My two brothers, one is an electrical engineer, mechanical engineer, but they're happy to stay at home, no debt, nothing. The problem is the 30-year-olds are going to become 40-year-olds now. So how do we solve for that?
So the corporate cash has gone to it's at a record high. It's well over R1 trillion, and it's gone up by above the inflation rate, which is quite impressive if you consider how weak the economy has been for an extended period of time. So corporates are behaving conservatively, and they do value cash, not because they're earning much money on it. They actually earn very little on it. It's just the availability. It's just having access, and they feel a lot more comfortable when they have access to it. And as I say, at the same time, they've kept their debt level fairly low. Now, that tends to apply to large companies, not to small and medium business. Small and medium business, completely different thing. They struggle, many are failing. They don't have excess cash in the business. But the big corporates do. So that balance sheet, I think, only gets utilized when confidence moves back above, if you want to watch a number, the 50 index level by the Bureau of Economic Research. Now, back in 2005, business confidence in South Africa was at an all-time record high. I think it was measured at about 82 index points. If you want to be above 50, it was 82 index points. And at that point, fixed investment was strong, and corporates were investing, and they were employing. As Frans said, it wasn't jobless growth. Over a period of 4 years, we created 1.5 million jobs in the formal sector. It was impressive, and companies were investing, and investing for the future. But if you look at the relationship, it's very much a confidence game. Now, when you look at the most recent confidence survey that came out about 2 weeks ago, it was another sharp decline, and confidence is incredibly depressed right now, and nowhere near a 50 index level. And I've never seen a country anywhere in the world where fixed investment, where corporates leverage their balance sheet positively, with this level of depressed confidence. It just doesn't happen. So corporates may find that they use the cash because that's the way they can survive. They've got to run down their cash balance, and that would be a worry. The bigger worry for me would be, we look at that balance sheet in some time and we find that corporates have disinvested. They've taken that balance sheet and they've externalized it. Now, corporates from time to time have done that in South Africa's history very unsuccessfully in the large part, right? And so there isn't this desire to, at the first instance, get out and invest in Australia. But if you see no prospect, no future, that's ultimately where that balance sheet will go, because it's got very little choice. So I would say that window to utilize to invigorate the corporate balance sheet and to use the cash, that window is not open forever, and it's a confidence game. And this is the bit I don't get about politics. If the ANC is worried about losing an election, and they recognize that better growth and employment would help them, make corporates happy. You make corporates happy, they unlock their balance sheet, they invest. They invest in stuff, they create jobs, and the ANC wins more votes. I just don't see what the downside is to that, other than in your head, you're giving up on some sort of ideology. And so what you're doing is you are diminishing your voter support in the quest to maintain this ideology. And yet the answer's right in front of you. Unlock the corporate balance sheet. We know, so let me give you an example. Government deregulated. Government got out of the way in a very important industry, and that was the energy industry. It said, okay, you can build any plant you want in terms of renewable energy. And it's only done that fairly recently. And have a look at how many private sector plants, how many private sector projects have been registered on the NERSA website to invest in renewable energy. It is massive. 2,700 megawatts have already been registered, running into hundreds of projects, right? And that response is the first 4 months of the year. And what is the private sector saying? You got out the way, and I decided I need to invest. I've got a balance sheet and I'm investing. And who benefits? The country. And who benefits from that? The ANC. To me, it's just obvious. But for some reason, politicians cannot go there. They can't get beyond their own ideology.
This is very important. You're completely right. You say the most important thing of the day. The mistake I've seen so many corporates make is to assume that the bottom lines of the world that you inhabit are the same in the political world, and they're different. You're all here because you're successful. You faced challenges, and when you met those, you understood the trends and took action and mitigation. You survived, otherwise you wouldn't be here. And the assumption business gets made, well, politics works on the same basis, and it doesn't. And this is why politicians sometimes struggle to understand businessmen, but also why business people often get their calls on politicians wrong. Because the bottom line in politics is something else. It's the ability to force a balance of power. It's the pursuit and application of power. This is what our liberal opposition doesn't understand, because very often they're actually really nice people. And the things top politicians have done to get to power in the free world and the non-free world are right. And if you get to the top, you did all those things, probably. And they truly are. I mean, offensive. And in the political world, you move when the opponent has forced a balance of power against you sufficiently serious that you have no option but to turn. And where we see the little turns, the twin tabbing effect started, the port, a little bit of fiscal proof, well, that's not new. It was new, it wasn't new in the 90s, and after 28 it was abandoned, returned. Where you see the return, you're seeing this application of pressure and power. You win by the application of pressure and power. It's different, fundamentally different bottom line to the corporate one, and such an important point that you make. Because if you understand that, and you leave this room with that understanding, you will much better anticipate the future moves of any of the governments that you are exposed to.
we're going to one more question, and then we're going to rule that the line under that one. Sorry, we had. Okay, 2 more questions, and then we're done.
Okay, cool. Just a quick answer from both of you. Kevin, do you think it will get worse before it gets better? And if so, what's your timeline? Of course, taking everything discussion that we discussed today. And the risk of, let's say Kakanyako leaving in the short term, because I think that's a huge risk in my mind. There's a stalwart there. Quick answers there. And then for you, Frans, clearly you're bullish, which is nice. Lucky to hear for a change. But simultaneously also mention and allude to the fact there's lots of blunders of effectively incompetence in government. Do you think they'll get it right?
So from my point of view, what I said earlier, I think is about right in my head, and that is we're at more or less the point of maximum pessimism. I think there is a lot that's gone wrong, and the list is endless. But I've been looking at, as we do these economic presentations, we're kind of searching for the balance. We don't want to always be positive or negative, we want to find the balance. And I must say I'm finding more positives to add to my presentation, which is incredibly good because it's very depressing in the last while. And I think that's partly a signal, and I think the energy story I'm more optimistic about. So I think we're at the point of maximum pessimism. I think it gets better. And I think it gets better for the next 2 years, where we feel better, confidence is better. And part of that is just an economic cycle. Interest rates come down. I think they get to a low in 2025. I think that all helps us. And I think that it corresponds with the global economic cycle. So I think we're into a better phase. What I'm not sure about is, have we got the wherewithal to make the important structural changes that put us on a growth path that is what's required? And that I can't answer. I haven't, so far, no. We've done nowhere near enough to put us on that better path. It's within our grasp. We've done it before, which is, this last week I've been trying to make that point. We did it before. We can do it again. But I think the jury's out, and if you were betting right now, you would bet against us being able to implement the necessary structural reforms to put us on the 3-4%. The difficulty for me is that a 1 to 2% economy does not end well for South Africa. We're just not Europe.
Yeah, I don't know. Does it end well here? If this is an accurate assessment, it's fundamentally free society. It's got mechanism to change without violence. The public is broadly pragmatic to get into that, but that's true. You have a wide array of opposition options to the centre right, and even the extreme right. We're much more vulnerable as a country to going right-wing authoritarian than left-wing Marxist. We're much more likely to get a sort of hybrid of Bolsonaro and Orban than getting a sort of left-wing dictator. If that remains the case, our importance to the West and the East of this great global struggle, the pragmatism that exists within corners of government, twin tabbing. If all of that is correct, you weigh that against the risks, the populism, the far left minority politics. I'd say to you that on a 10-year view, and I try to make it quantitative, 75%, the room we'll sit in 10 years from now will be a much better one than the one we're sitting in a year ago. 25%, we won't take sufficient advantage of these factors. It will be a sort of enclave society with a few islands of complete excellence, sort of fortresses, and seas of greater poverty and desperation. So I'd say 75%.
Very last question, unfortunately.
Yes. In your opinion, Frans, big lady or load anyway? That's the one part.
Okay.
What do you make of Julius Malema having discussions with Esma Shula?
Esma Shula is another hope. I like to answer the second one. Actually, to forget to ask the first one. In a model polling exercise, the world was created for voters in which the ANC split into these key shades of an RET ANC and another ANC. This was created very vividly. And people then asked, if these events happen, how will you vote? If the RET side goes out on its own and sets itself up and gets expelled or takes over the ANC or whatever, 15% of the vote doesn't seem. So he doesn't have the levers to get very far. Perhaps he's useful to the EFF and a few sort of municipal corners of the Free State where he still holds some sway. On Lady R, I prefer not to answer your question because I'm on camera.
Thank you for your kind question. So that brings us to the end of today's festivities, and it has been a riveting audience. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your kind attention, and I know it's a long time sitting on chairs, but it's been really fascinating listening to our speakers. Thank you to Kevin and Frans for being here and sharing us all of your wisdom. This has been the 2023 version of The Elephant in the Room. We are INN8, we are the advisor's partner, and I look forward to sharing some refreshments with you after the show.
INN8 is a registered trademark of Stanlib Wealth Management Pty Limited, an authorised financial services provider.